So historically, push notification MFA was easily overcome with a technique dubbed MFA fatigue, where the threat actor would either try repeatedly logging in or using a scripted tool to attempt repeated logins. And all these attempts would generate prompts on the user's phone, who would eventually accept it just to make it stop.
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I am your host, Luke McNamara. Joining me today, we have Josh Fleischer. He's a principal security analyst with Mandiant's Managed Defense Group. Josh, great to have you here this morning.
Hey, Luke, happy to be here.
So our topic for discussion today is something that we touched on and wrote about in the M-Trends report this past year. MFA bypass techniques, adversary in the middle. A lot that I want to jump in and talk to you about sort of how we are seeing this continue to play out this year, because it is a trend that didn't end in the beginning of 2024 magically. No, these are trends that continue, and maybe some of what we're seeing today is a little bit different. There's probably a lot that is kind of similar to the adversary behavior we saw around this last year, but maybe to kick us off, if you could sort of describe what is MFA bypass, the adversary in the middle activity that we've been seeing in recent years.
Sure. So, adversary in the middle, or AiTM, is one of a few ways that attackers can adopt to overcome MFA enforcement. Adversary in the middle is definitely the hottest technique at the moment based on what we're seeing. So, adversary in the middle is a type of phishing attack that uses a proxy server that sits between the victim and a legitimate authentication service. And this proxy server intercepts and forwards the data back and forth during the login. After the victim submits their credentials and passes MFA and completes their sign in, the authentication service is going to send a session or access token back to the user, but it's going to be sent back through that AiTM proxy, which ultimately gets retrieved by the attacker. And there's some other features included with popular AiTM frameworks. And because it acts as a proxy, a lot of AiTM servers will be able to automatically apply custom branding or templates that a target organization uses. So stuff like logos that might be expected by the end user will still be shown to further increase credibility. And AiTM pages can also collect the victim's browser user agent and IP address, which an attacker can use to further try to evade detection.
So I think it's useful to also kind of set this in context of some of the other trends that we saw last year. So phishing was the second most common initial infection vector, but we also called out and noted that we are seeing sort of other non-traditional methods of that threat actors are breaking in. So phishing across social media, for example, and other sorts of I think there's kind of this fits into the larger category of more evasion of detection techniques that we're seeing threat actors employ. So some of what you noted, historically with things like credential collection, where a threat actor would spoof a webmail login page. That's not a new technique. We've certainly seen that before, but it does seem now, as organizations have gotten better at having multi-factor authentication of some form factored in, now the adversaries also have to consider that. So, maybe, we touched on kind of high level what's taking place with adversary in the middle activity, but maybe also get into some of the why. Why is this as a trend something we are seeing employed more now than before?
Yeah, and you touched on it with multi-factor authentication being more commonplace. I think main driving factor is just out of necessity from the threat actor's perspective. More organizations are using MFA. I think most organizations understand now that you can't just protect your assets with a single factor password. So this kind of pushes threat actors to come up with techniques to overcome this. Another big reason is that cloud is just more lucrative nowadays than ever before. And I think especially since the pandemic, and the move towards working from home. There's more and more data living in an organization's cloud, and we're seeing both financially motivated attackers and espionage driven nation state attackers that are solely targeting cloud environments.
A piece of this also, I think, ties into the resources that are available for threat actors that want to get involved in this. So you've always had phishing kits out there, but it seems like now we're seeing more phishing kits that are implementing methods of capturing, the multi-factor authentication process. And we'll touch a little bit later in sort of mitigations because I think a piece of this is also that not all multi-factor authentication is created equal. There's certainly ones that are more resistant to this sort of activity. But that's, I think, something where we've seen sort of the lowering of the barriers to entry for maybe some of those lower skilled, from a technical standpoint, threat actors that want to get involved in and leverage this capability.
I agree with all that. I think AITM is more accessible now than ever before. Setting up an adversary in the middle phishing page is more complex than yesterday's simple HTML forms, but has as time has gone on, these public adversary in the middle toolkits have become more refined, better understood, more popular. Like most things, there's a lot of YouTube tutorials out there on setting it up, which I actually invite all listeners to go check out if you're interested. It definitely helped me with my understanding of how it works and their capabilities. But beyond all that, even if you don't have the skills or resources to set up an AITM server yourself, there's a new segment in the cyber criminal marketplace that it's emerged called phishing as a service, where for relatively low pricing, you can just rent a fully maintained AITM infrastructure to use in your phishing campaigns.
And can you modify that based on the targets you're going after? So let's say I'm interested in spear phishing and targeting users at a particular university. Can I modify, you mentioned like the logos and the sort of look of all of that with these services?
The interesting thing about that is it mostly happens automatically, so it doesn't really need much customization. When the victim enters in their credentials, it's going to read the domain that it belongs to in their email address, connect to that authentication service, and proxy a lot of that branding and templates, stuff in the CSS file that's on that login page. So it really doesn't require too much manual setup by the attacker.
Well, let's get into some examples where you've seen this, some interesting war stories to kind of help like walk us through what this might look like in operation and maybe even what it looks like to the defender in responding to it.
Yeah, so we've been witnessing phishing campaigns where the user receives a QR code phishing email. So instead of a link to a phishing page or an attached document that has a link to the phishing page within that, we'll just see an image of a QR code attached to the email, which, as it turns out, will slip by a lot of email gateways.
Yeah, I think this is just to jump in here real quickly. I think this is another example of the sort of evasion of detection trend playing out. Right, we're seeing this in a number of different ways, but the usage or the uptick in QR codes as a method to carry out this activity is again threat actors looking for ways to sort of evade traditional security detections.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were a little bit skeptical when we first saw this technique being tried, but I think it's proven its success. The email will pretend to be from the user's cloud authentication service, and it will tell the user something like the authentication app on their phone got disconnected, and it instructs them to scan that QR code to reconnect it. And I think a lot of people wouldn't question this, especially as QR codes are used more and more in our everyday lives, and especially when used with signing into services. So we witnessed the user scan that QR code on their on their personal phone. They followed the link, and that actually directed them to an adversary in the middle phishing page. And what's worse is now that the victim is signing into that phishing page from their personal device, which isn't managed, and therefore bypassing the expensive web filtering tools that the organization invested in on their corporate laptops. And that was the start of a year long cloud compromise.
I think another piece where this, I'm just thinking of all the other components in M trends this story kind of touches on, but the increasing targeting of mobile, whether that's SMS based phishing, whether it's SIM swap, another sort of theme that this kind of links back to.
Absolutely, yeah. That still remains a threat today. SIM swapping attacks.
So in this particular case, what is the sort of secondary form of authentication that the adversary is bypassing?
So in this case, it was just a push notification based MFA, which is typically the default for most organizations. And I do want to stress the point that not all MFA methods are created equal. And unfortunately, the most commonly implemented methods are also the ones that are targeted and exploited by AiTM phishing. There's only two main AiTM phishing resistant methods. Unfortunately, they're costlier to implement, both from a financial and management perspective. One of them is certificate based authentication, but this requires organizations to manage and deploy these certificates and keep them regularly updated. The other one is using FIDO2 hardware. This is good, but it's also expensive, especially if you're deploying this to your entire organization.
Right, this might be something that is less feasible for an organization that has a lot of people coming and going. Again, challenges in kind of maintaining and providing that sort of to new entrants can be costly, especially also if you have a very large organization.
Absolutely. But I do think at a minimum, organizations should strive to at least enforce these more robust MFA methods for privileged users. Could start there with the eventual goal of moving it to the entire organization.
So with the push notification form of secondary authentication, what are some of the common ways we see threat actors getting around that?
So historically, push notification MFA was easily overcome with a technique dubbed MFA fatigue, where the threat actor would either try repeatedly logging in or using a scripted tool to attempt repeated logins. And all these attempts would generate prompts on the user's phone who would eventually accept it just to make it stop.
Right. So this would be a situation where you're getting all these notifications on your phone. They appear to be coming from the legitimate authentication app or whatever service you're using to provide that secondary form of authentication. And it just appears that it's bugging out, right? That there's some issue. And so just to make it stop, you hit accept, right? And that's how then the adversary has bypassed that method, gaining access.
So push notification MFA has gotten a bit more robust with a feature called numbers matching, which requires an extra step and also adds some context to that login prompt that appears on your phone. However, this is still exploitable by AITM because even if you get that push notification on your phone and you accept it, ultimately that adversary in the middle proxy will intercept that access token, which the threat actor can turn around and use to log in.
So to go back to the story where the threat actor had been targeting this one entity, and you said that they had gotten access for over a period of a year. What was the threat actor doing from there? What did the threat actor do following the initial access being granted?
That was an interesting case. It was a financially motivated attacker. So we saw them perusing through a lot of their documents and emails looking for invoices, other sensitive financial information. And they also use that organization as a place to conduct further attacks against other organizations.
And was there sort of the motivation of that threat actor? Was it sort of an actor, as we see a lot today, engaged in data theft or for extortion? What was sort of the end kind of target and goal of that operation?
Yeah, so we witnessed in the next stage of that operation the threat actor abusing the organization's virtual desktop environment to maintain access and also pivot to other accounts. I think many organizations have a virtual desktop environment, which with cloud access lets you launch a desktop to log into. The problem in this case is that due to an oversight in configuration, that virtual desktop environment was considered a trusted location. And many organizations will have access policies set up to only enforce MFA from untrusted locations. So, because of this, they were able to log into several other accounts, s- essentially just single factor using only the password, since MFA wasn't enforced from that VDI environment. So, no phishing was needed for the other accounts.
And ultimately, this was a threat actor engaged in data theft. So presumably, they're at some point they're exfiltrating data from the victim environment.
Yeah, data exfiltration and also using it to leveraging that access to get into other organizations with a relationship with that organization.
So as we started talking about at the beginning, I think again, there's a couple of different themes that nexus into this topic of adversary in the middle. One I think is also, especially like in cloud environments, it seems, session and access tokens and token theft. Can you kind of walk us through how that takes place and how that relates to adversary in the middle activity?
Yeah, that's the key portion of adversary in the middle phishing, which I think is important to understand. So, access tokens are what gets issued to the user by the web service after they log in. And it essentially acts in place of credentials, making it so you don't have to log in with your password and MFA every time you visit. And it also gets used when you navigate around that service to access other resources. But a major flaw in the way that access tokens are currently implemented and used across most of the industry today is their high potential for theft and the consequences that follow that.
And where is that theft typically taking place? Is it taking place after the threat actor has gained access to an account, to a victim environment, or is it also part of that adversary in the middle activity in the initial phishing process?
Yeah, so we're witnessing these access token thefts occurring in a few different ways. The main way that we're seeing at the moment is through adversary in the middle phishing, where the token gets intercepted right after it's being issued to the user. Another popular method, which we've really seen a uptick in recent times, is data stealing or info stealer malware that's specifically designed to target and exfiltrate session tokens that are resident on a computer and exfiltrate it directly from there. And another method we've seen is attackers exploiting vulnerabilities to cause the disclosure of these tokens, especially from edge devices that are internet facing. One good example of that in recent times is the Citrix Bleed CVE from late 2023. Those appliances are often internet facing, and if they're running a vulnerable version, it would leak valid session tokens, which we'd witness the threat actor obtain, turn around, and plug that into their browser and assume an existing login session.
Sure. So the info stealer theme again has been really central, I think, to a lot of what we've seen this year as a precursor to activity, especially the extortion activity, the data theft, how threat actors are breaking into organizations. I think of that often in the context of username password, obviously as part of the stolen credentials. But as you know, these are also stealing session tokens. This malware has the capacity to steal that. Is that something we're often seeing utilized on kind of in parallel, or is that something because obviously these are typically fairly short-lived tokens, is my understanding. So in cases, for example, where InfoStealer may have stolen credentials that go back maybe several years, as we've seen with some breaches this year. I would imagine any session token stolen at that time would no longer really be useful. So I'm just kind of curious the breakdown of where we are seeing that in intrusions attacks that leverage stolen credentials. Maybe kind of a rough idea or percentage where they're also leveraging still valid session tokens.
I would say it's a mix of the two. I think it really depends on the timing of when the machine was infected. If it was a relatively recent infection and the threat actor can move fast enough and the user happened to have signed in recently, then they'll absolutely use session tokens as a means. So using access tokens is a great way for threat actors to evade access policies that an organization may have set up. And that's because these access policies, which might include geo IP restrictions, checking whether the login is coming from a managed device, or also enforcing MFA on the login. Those policies are only checked at the initial login stage, which is before the session or access token gets issued. So after it's issued, it's kind of implied that the user passed all this, and an attacker is able to bypass those security controls.
So let's talk a little bit about detection and remediation. So I think we've clearly laid the basis that this is a problem. This is a problem that we're continuing to see. What are some methods that you've seen that have tended to be more successful in detecting this activity? And then we'll get into remediation as well.
So one detection technique that we've had a lot of success at Managed Defense is looking for shifts in the ASN. Basically, when a user logs in, you'll see them logging in from an expected ASN or geolocation. But if they're logging in through an AiTM proxy, the authentication service is only going to see the login from the proxy side, which is going to be at an ASN different from the user's typical login location. And those logins will also typically be associated with data centers. Those logins will also typically be associated with data centers rather than a residential IP that might belong to the user. After the login flow is complete and the access token is stolen, we'll then see the threat actor use that access token to log in. And from there, the ASN is going to shift again to another network that the threat actor belongs to. So monitoring for these shifts in ASNs goes a long way in helping highlight some suspicious activity that is worth looking deeper into.
And of course, there's other parts of that attack lifecycle that you could potentially be detecting for and catching that activity, especially assuming that you have proper logging in place on some of these systems as the threat actor tries to move laterally or escalate privileges. But you're saying kind of this is where you would want to focus on that sort of initial utilizing adversary in the middle techniques to gain access.
Yeah, as far as the initial phase of that, you definitely want to focus on that. And you also want to pay attention to failed attempts. Even if you have strong MFA controls in place that ultimately block the login from happening, keep in mind that the user, to get to that point, has still fallen victim to a phishing attack. So to get that far, they've already input their username, their password. The MFA might be blocking them, but at that point, the threat actor still has the account name, their password, and especially in the case of AiTM projects, they'll also have the user agent string and an IP address associated with the user, which the threat actor can then turn around to try credential stuffing attacks on other accounts associated with that user, or also maybe try a social engineering campaign against the IT desk that belongs to that organization using that.
So let's maybe shift then to the remediation part of this. So you have a user in your organization that may have been compromised to some extent, or you suspect the threat actor has gained access. What are some methods organizations can take, some steps they can take to remediate this threat?
So remediation is key. Organizations should start with disabling the account. They should revoke all active sessions that belong to that user. They should also reset the user's password. Make sure that proper logging is set up so you can have a comprehensive view of all the activity that took place from the attacker. You want to make sure that the attacker didn't leave behind any other secondary forms of access on that account. Oftentimes, we witness attackers registering their own MFA method after they obtain initial access, which is also a great detection strategy. But we'll also see attackers adding their own recovery options. So you want to make sure you identify all this to prevent them from gaining access again to the account.
So tying this all up, I'm curious, kind of in closing here, what are your thoughts on where this activity is going, having seen it evolve? having seen it still be something that threat actors continue to leverage. Um, and also assuming that we continue to see this trend of evasion of detection where threat actors are becoming more creative in how they go about stealing and utilizing credentials, how they go about phishing organizations. I'm curious your thoughts on, where this might head, and then also what are steps, as we've kind of touched on throughout this, that organizations can take to mitigate or harden their environments.
I think in the near term, we're going to see a continuation of adversary in the middle. It's going to be more accessible. We're going to see it affecting more organizations. I think it all comes down to flaws in how access tokens are used and implemented in the industry today because they're so susceptible to theft at the moment. And there are mitigations for theft, such as binding the token to its intended user, but these mitigations aren't widely adopted today. But I would say the industry has definitely taken notice of this problem and is moving towards a solution to combat that. So hopefully this becomes less of an issue in the coming years.
Awesome. And any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, we see a variety of phishing techniques and phishing lures. The phishing portion of attacks has always been very experimental. So I think it's important to just keep up to date with the latest happenings in security. Keep following InfoSec feeds. Keep listening to your favorite InfoSec podcasts. Keep asking yourself if you're able to detect this and what it would look like in your organization. And keep asking yourself whether or not you'd be able to detect this and how it'd look in your organization if it were to happen.
Fantastic. We'll end it right there. Josh, thanks for your insight and thoughts on this trend. And we'll see how it emerges. And I'm sure we'll pop up in the M Trends report for next year. But thanks for your insights into this today. Have a great day.
Appreciate that, Luke. Thanks.